Hi guys, Jackie from Famished Farm, and we are back this week making recipes from my 4-inch thick recipe stash. This week I have 3 new recipes to try. First up is a smothered pork chop recipe by Meredith Deeds. This recipe looked interesting because it was another brined recipe, this time with a sugar and salt brine, and the other ingredients just were an unusual mix of ingredients that I think are going to be really delicious. Our second recipe this week is from Jessica Sowards of Roots and Refuge Farm, and I picked this recipe, a roasted tomato salsa recipe, for a couple reasons. I love that her technique uses roasting as the method for preparing the tomatoes, peppers, onions, and garlic. And she encourages you to tweak the spices to fit your own taste. I don't like cilantro, so we just substitute parsley. Now, we have a family favorite recipe that came from an aunt, and we use that recipe all the time. It uses stewed tomatoes as part of the recipe, which I think is going to be very close to the roasting tomatoes. So I'm really looking forward to trying this. And I've got my hubby ready to do a taste test as soon as the salsa's ready. My third recipe this week is for blueberry English muffins, and that recipe is from Pamela Reed at the Brooklyn Farm Girl. Who doesn't love Thomas's blueberry English muffins? That's one of the reasons I picked it. But I also am having a major fail recently with English muffins, so this is my second attempt to find a recipe that will not replace my sourdough English muffin recipe, but that will just be another option. And guys, remember, I put all the timestamps in the description down below with links to the recipes. Come on, let's get cooking. I had such great luck with my brined pork kebab recipe I did a few weeks ago that when I saw this recipe for smothered pork chops that included a salt and sugar brine, I jumped on it. So that's what I'm doing here. 3 cups of water and 1/3 of a cup each of salt and sugar. It calls for kosher. I just use sea salt. We're going to mix that together, and you want to mix it until your sugar and your salt has dissolved. The other thing in this recipe is the addition of Dijon mustard and maple syrup. She said that it kind of has a hint of a sweet and sour flavor, and I really like the thought of that. So here I am now. These are my pork chops that are just going to be brined in the refrigerator for the next 4 or 5 hours. She does recommend a minimum of 1 hour or up to 4 hours. I may have been slightly longer than the 4. Once your brining time is up, we're going to just take a paper towel on a plate and just pat these dry. Using the oil of your choice, we have the heat on medium, and we're going to get this oil heated up. It says to use the large skillet or Dutch oven. I'm obviously using my cast iron there. While that's heating up, we're going to go ahead and get some garlic and onions going. And I'm still working on my sweet onions. It does call for yellow onions, so that's close enough. She does call for just slicing these thinly. I think I went ahead and chopped them. Do whatever you like, guys. Now I'm not going to get this finished because I start to smell the oil getting hot. So we're going to take a dredge of some flour, a 1/2 cup, and we're going to put both sides of the pork chops through the flour dredge and then put that into our pan. Guys, as you can hear, my pan was really a bit too hot, and you'll see that from the color that comes off these pork chops. They weren't burnt, but they were a little darker than I might like. So we're going to finish up with our onions here. Again, thinly slice. I don't know why I went to the extra work of chopping, but there you have it. And then I do have some fresh garlic this time, so I will be mincing that up. Here you can see I'm going to check on these pork chops, and it does call for browning them for about 4 minutes per side. And as you can see, the bone side there is a little darker than I might like, but it did not impact the flavor, luckily. That one was perfect. And then we're going to let these cook on the other side for another 4 minutes. Calls for finely chopping the garlic. I'm just going to use my mincer here to get that ready. And then when I'm done with that, I've got a plate ready to transfer the pork chops out of the pan and onto the plate. And we'll just kind of keep them sitting on the side here for a few minutes while we finish up the onions. I'm a little off kilter here, but I am adding the garlic and the onions. And it calls for some salt and pepper too. And you're going to just stir these frequently, and you're just trying to caramelize the onions. It's going to take about 15 minutes to get them softened and lightly browned. This is my high heat burner, so I'm not going very far as these onions are cooking because I don't want them to burn. When we're done, we're going to take 2 tablespoons of our flour dredge, and then we're just going to cook this flour. So spread it over, let it sit for a minute or so. Now we're going to create a roux with some chicken broth or chicken stock. I'm using my homemade bone broth, and it's coming out of the freezer, so it's a little solid still, so this is going to take a few extra minutes. If you're doing chicken stock, you can just pretty much dump that in there and get going. This is going to have to come back up to temperature, and then we're going to add 2 tablespoons of Dijon and 2 tablespoons of pure maple syrup, and mix that all together well. Now, you are going to want to get all the good oniony bits up off the bottom of the pan and any of the remaining juices from the pork chops that were in there. You're creating a very flavorful, very delicious gravy. Now, I can tell you guys, this recipe was awesome. It was delicious. I, in fact, saved the gravy that was left over and froze it, and I am actually tonight making another pork recipe out of the leftovers from this gravy. So I've been stirring this off and on, and what you're doing is you're going to bring this back up to a boil, and once you hit the boiling mark, you're going to reduce your heat to low and then just simmer it for the next 20 minutes. This recipe is not a fast recipe, guys, but it is worth taking your time with. So maybe make it on a weekend, not a weeknight. The recipe calls for it coming to temperature in about 5 to 8 minutes. Again, use your thermometer just to make sure. Guys, this was absolutely delicious. I can't remember now what we served this with, and I don't have a picture of that. She suggests serving with mashed potatoes, rice, or buttered noodles. Whatever you serve it with, no worries, because it is going to be delicious. The gal that wrote this recipe is from Minnesota, so I just got a kick out of this. Was her version of a improvement on a southern pork chop. So regardless where it came from, Minnesota, down south, this is one that will go into your rotation. Just remember, it takes a little bit of time to get this flavor, but it's worth your investment. Growing up, we didn't eat a lot of salsa. My parents were not fans of Mexican food, so it wasn't until I was a newly married person that I started enjoying Mexican food. And this is a great time of year to start preserving some tomatoes. And what better way than homemade salsa? Now, I mentioned in the preview that I am going to be using some of my favorite spices from a family favorite recipe. And I will put that recipe in the description also, from my Aunt Suzy. And this is a recipe that you can just pick up grocery store ingredients and, make in the dead of winter when you don't have fresh tomatoes. It calls for 2 cans of stewed tomatoes. I frequently make a half a recipe and then just use 1 can. But here you see we're going to be preparing. I've got my scale going, and her recipe, Jessica's recipe, calls for 6 pounds of tomatoes, and I have some beautiful big slicer tomatoes here that are ready and willing to go into the oven for me. So I'm just cutting out the cores of the tomatoes. In the roasting process, you're going to be able to slide the skins off if you prefer. Jessica mentioned she does not do that. She wants to get the nutrition from the skins. I'm going to opt to take those skins off. And you'll also cut out any bad spots out of your tomatoes. While waiting to make this, I had 2 of the tomatoes get some significant bad spots in the bottom, so just cut those off. And typically the bottom of the tomato, you might have a brown knotty bit there, just slice that off too. You'll want some cookie sheets to put your tomatoes, peppers, and garlic on. It took, I used 2. I could have probably done 1 cookie sheet and 1 9x13 pan. If you've got some combination that would be equivalent to about 3 9x13 pans, you'd be about right. Just line these up single rows. You'll notice the peppers there. I did take the seeds and stems out of the peppers. That's just a family preference. We like the flavor. We don't like heat. And then I do have some garlic cloves that the recipe calls for a whole clove, a whole bulb rather, so 10 to 13 cloves. I probably use 6, and again, family preference, not huge garlic people. We like it, just not a lot of it. So I use probably half the clove of garlic, and then 2 whole onions. And I've still got my Vidalias here, so that's what I'm using. I've got my oven preheated for 350 degrees, and these are going to go in and roast for about 45 minutes. Just keep an eye on them. You don't want everything to get real charred, but any nice char will do. I have never canned salsa because I just can't find a recipe that is similar enough to my aunt's recipe that makes me want to can it. So the method of freezer preserving is a fantastic idea for people that maybe you already have a recipe that's a favorite, so adapt it for the freezer. And when I saw Jessica make this salsa, and this has been on her website, it's dated May of 2022, but when I saw her make this, I was, immediately drawn to it because I just could see the potential for this tasting a lot like my Aunt Suzy's recipe. So here we go. We're going to put these both pans into the oven. I don't think I even bother to switch the pans or anything. Just set my timer for 45 minutes and do some waiting. So you'll see I've already got a head start on this, and I basically have put the onions and the peppers and the garlic into my food processor, and I've just pulsed them until they are just processed to whatever degree of whatever consistency you like. And for me, this part of it is very fine, and so it's coming out pretty, almost like a puree. And then you'll see me in the background, I start picking at the tomato skins. And this is just a personal preference. You guys do whatever you prefer. They're going to be processed, so if you don't mind them being in your salsa, then you go for it. But I'm just trying to do these while they're still a little bit too hot, but they slip off pretty nicely. So only in a couple places do I get a little too warm on the fingers. Now notice all that liquid that has weeped out of the tomatoes. This is great because you are going to pick these tomatoes up with a slotted spoon. I happen to grab a spatula, a metal spatula with slots in it. Whatever you've got that can pick these tomatoes up and leave that juice sitting in the pan. That just means that your salsa is going to be that much thicker without doing anything, without adding anything to make it a little bit thicker. You'll notice on some of these tomatoes, there's a pretty big white core section still remaining in the tomato. Those will not process in the food processor very well. They're a little tougher than everything else. So I just kind of fish those out of the pureed mix once I'm done processing them. One thing I want to emphasize is this is not a water bath canning or a pressure canning situation. This is freezer preserving. This recipe has not been rated or reviewed for any type of canning safety. So just keep that in mind. If you are an experienced canner and you're feeling comfortable playing with those kind of things, then you make your own decision. But again, I am not comfortable doing things that aren't already in one of the ball canning books or the National Canning Site website. So this is why I'm choosing this year to make salsa and preserve it in the freezer. Now, don't go too heavy on the pulsing of your tomatoes, otherwise you will have just liquid. I do just a couple short bursts and then dump it into the big bowl that has the onions, peppers, and garlic in it. So this is a recipe that you can keep in the fridge for 10, 12 days, she says. And I know that I've kept salsa longer than that in the refrigerator. But then once it's canned, you can leave it in the freezer for several months. So just cycle through all of your tomatoes. So rinse and repeat on that, on the processing of your tomatoes, and then throw them into your big bowl. Now, while your tomatoes were in the oven, you could, if you were using cilantro, you could use that time to wash and prepare your cilantro. The recipe calls for 2 bunches. I am choosing, though, just to use dried parsley out of my garden from last year. We don't care for cilantro, so that's why I'm using parsley instead. Once your tomatoes are processed, then you're just going to add the rest of the ingredients. So at this point, you guys would be adding your cilantro. Her recipe calls for a 1/4 cup of honey, the juice of a whole lemon, roughly a 1/4 cup, 2 tablespoons of sea salt, and whatever else your heart desires. In my case, I'm going to add hot sauce. I'm going to try her honey and lemon juice edition, and then I use just a fraction of the salt that she does and a couple teaspoons of dried cumin powder. In the video, her husband taste tests this before she adds the honey, and so I wanted to see if he would know that there was a difference, and he did. So that's kind of why I'm trying this addition of the honey to the recipe, and then I'm using bottled lemon juice instead of a whole lemon. And then you're just going to give this a good mix. You'll notice while I'm mixing, if I see any big white bits that are tomato core, I go ahead and pull those out. And then I'm going to taste test too and just make sure that everything tastes okay. I did add about a 1/2 teaspoon of salt prior, and I'm testing here with a tortilla chip. I add about another 1/2 teaspoon and then taste it again, and everything is delicious. Now, I had ordered some 1 cup freezer containers on Amazon. They did not arrive, so I've got a couple. I have a pint and a quart container of those freezer containers that I've saved over the last couple of probably Chinese wonton soup containers, and so I'm going to use those, and then the rest of the salsa will go into jars, and everything again going into the freezer. And I only fill the jars about 3/4 of the way full because that's about how much I want to have on hand for a week where we do a Mexican dinner, and maybe we need salsa for tacos, enchiladas, or maybe we just want to have chips. And these jars, we are not going to be canning these guys, so you can just reuse some of your old lids for this purpose. And if you have any salsa that's not going to go into the freezer for whatever reason, I had about a cup of salsa left in the bowl there, and I'm just going to put that into storage, just into a glass storage dish that goes right into the fridge. And we're going to have this with some chips probably tonight just to use it up. So this recipe made about 6 pints of salsa, so about a pint per pound of tomatoes. It's a great recipe, guys. Give it a try, and be sure to taste test, because then you'll know if you need to add something that will make it your own personal favorite. This will be something that I do every year from here on out. It is just so nice to have salsa on hand. We do weekly Mexican dinners, and it is just going to be a godsend to have this. I said earlier I really love the Thomas's blueberry English muffins, and I do. They're just delicious. They smell so good when they're toasting. So that was one of the reasons that I grabbed this particular recipe. The other one is that I am looking for a non-sourdough English muffin recipe that is going to be consistent. And I tried one earlier this year and it just didn't work out. And I'm just going to tell you guys, this recipe for me doesn't work. And part of that is my fault. I thought I had 2 cups of frozen blueberries in the freezer, and it turns out one of the packages was not blueberries, it was blackberries. So you'll see that in a minute. But here I am. I've scalded the milk. I'm adding warm water and then a package of active dry yeast. And I'm just going to mix that. I'm going to hydrate the yeast, and then I'm going to let it sit so it can proof. I wasn't worried about only having frozen blueberries. These are out of my garden, but black beans would not work. So I pull out my cranberry pulp. My friend Darlene has used the Thomas's cranberry muffins when they are out, and so that is what made me think of this. Now, here I am. I'm getting ready to add 3 of the 6 cups of flour the recipe calls for, some melted butter, that's about a 1/4 cup. Boy, did I make a mess in the microwave getting that melted. And then you're going to stir this up well. Make sure everything is combined. And then we're going to add some salt. Now, I would add more salt, guys, and I never say that, but this recipe needed the full teaspoon of salt. And in the comments, you'll notice that many people said a full teaspoon was not enough. So you might even consider doubling that. We'll add the other 3 cups of flour. And then we're going to add our cranberry pulp, and this is 1 cup, and then 1 cup of the still frozen blueberries. And then mix that well. So, and she has you mix this whole recipe by hand, which the dough turns out to be very wet. And this is something I just don't remember in my sourdough recipe, and maybe I need to go back and revisit that. But this was even more wet than adding the cranberry pulp should have made it. So I think it's just a very wet dough. But it does tell you that with your hands, once everything is combined, knead the dough for 5 minutes with your hands. Well, there's just no way to knead a wet dough like that. So I'm not sure how this would work out. So she says to fold it over and over again. Now, does that mean to put it down onto a floured surface and knead it like, old days? Or does that mean to do the turn and fold of like the current recipes? I don't know. She doesn't specify. Nobody seems to know. But I'm going to end up adding more flour, and we'll see what we can make of this. We're going to get this initially mixed up pretty well, and then we're going to make a call here. So guys, what do you do at this point? Your dough is so wet, there's no way you can knead it. Would you have just, put the saran wrap on it and let it sit and rise for an hour? Or would you do what I'm about to do, which is to add more flour to make it into a, somewhat of a dough-like situation? I don't know. Again, I've got to pull out my old sourdough English muffin recipe and see if that called for a wet dough like this. But I can tell you, I'm just going to give you the the bottom line is the dough rose beautifully. It turned out to be a wonderful bread dough, but there's no nooks and crannies on these English muffins. And even the picture that she shows on the website shows the texture of bread, not the texture of an English muffin. So this for me was not a good copycat of the Thomas's homemade English muffins. But anyway, we're gonna do what we can to get our blueberries incorporated. As you can see, it takes a little bit to get those all in there. And so look how sticky that is. I mean, I ended up having to add probably another cup of flour on this first part of just trying to do some tucks and folds, and then I get to the point where I'm just gonna start kneading like I've been taught to knead. And of course, during this process, I'm trying to get laundry done today, and the timer goes off during the middle of this, so I have to clean my hands and go feed the washer. And it just is kind of a pain. But we did finally get this dough into just a beautiful dough. Like I said, a beautiful bread dough. So we're going to put some oil in the bowl that we used to mix it. Put the ball of dough in that. Spray the top of the ball of dough with some cooking spray. And then we will cover it with some saran wrap and let it rest for an hour. And then using our silicone mat again, we're going to punch down the dough, flour the mat, and we're going to roll these out into a 1/2 inch thickness. Now the first batch that I make of these, this first round, I think I did pretty good on the 1/2 inch, but the second batch where you're taking all your little trimmings and making another ball, I think that was definitely too thick. That was probably closer to 3/4 of an inch thick instead of a 1/2 inch. So just be careful there. I know they make those guides for rolling pins that show you how deep your thickness is, and I really need to invest in one of those because I could use it. I'm not a very accurate judge of thickness. The recipe calls for using cornmeal on your baking sheets. I'm going to just choose to use these nonstick pads that I've got, these mats that fit into my cookie sheets instead of the cornmeal. I hate the mess of dusting off the cornmeal after things are cooked. So you guys just do whatever you're comfortable with. If you want to follow the recipe, spread or sprinkle some cornmeal on 2 or 3 cookie sheets. And I placed 6 English muffins on each one. I could have easily put 8 or probably more. They don't spread a lot. Once the final rise is done, you're going to cover these with plastic wrap and let them rise for an additional 30 minutes before putting them in a 375-degree oven. And this is a little different than some recipes. I think my old recipe, you brown them in you either cook them all the way or you just brown them in a cast iron. I can't remember. It's been a long time since I made them my other way. But you're going to bake them at 375, flipping them after 8 minutes, and you'll get a nice browning on both sides doing it with this method. At least I found I did. So here's where I'm going to gather all these scraps and get them into a ball again. Just make sure your surface is floured so it doesn't stick. And I maybe should have let this rest a little bit more before trying to cut these out. The dough, you can see, is really springy at this point. It probably would have been a good idea to let it rest. And I don't know if you can tell, these are quite a bit thicker than the other ones. So watch your thickness. Oh, and guys, it calls for spraying the top of your muffins before putting the plastic wrap on them, or putting cornmeal on them on the tops too. Again, I'm just choosing not to do that. except I run out of mats because this did take 4 cookie sheets to get all 22 of my English muffins on here. So I did do this last sheet with a little bit of cornmeal, but I sprayed the top. Okay, they're all cut out and they are resting on their sheets for half an hour. And again, I've got the oven set for 375. So I'm gonna go ahead and start both my ovens and cook these all at the same time. So I will end up rotating when you flip them after 8 minutes. I'm going to rotate the sheets from front to back and side to side, just so they're getting even coverage in the oven. And I don't have to say this, guys, but yes, remove the plastic wrap before those go into the oven. Otherwise, you'll be throwing away the whole mess. Now, these baked up beautifully. I did, on the ones that were thicker, I did put them back in the oven for an additional 5 minutes, I think. I don't have, actually, I had ordered one from Amazon, temperature gauge for baked goods and stuff, but I did not get that in. I was hoping to use it on these, but just using the feel test and looking at the color, I decided that the thicker ones needed to go back in. And you want to know, I think even the littler ones I put back in for a couple minutes. Some of them were like beautifully brown, like the ones there in the middle, and some of them could have used a couple more minutes. And that is not the fault of the recipe, guys. Every oven varies temperature-wise, and also because I made these bigger than the recipe called for, they're going to take a little bit longer to cook. So here we are flipping another tray, and you can see this tray doesn't have very much color at all. So that's one of the reasons that I'm flipping them top to bottom rack and then front to back also. So if anybody makes this recipe, let me know what you guys think about the texture. English muffins, you're supposed to have nooks and crannies where your butter and your jam, you know, kind of pools into those little nooks and crannies, and they're kind of crunchy. These, again, they were the texture of bread, not so much English muffins. But I hesitate to say, because I made so many changes to the recipe. If you guys make it and you use fresh blueberries and you follow the recipe perfectly, let me know if you have any different results, and maybe I'll have to revisit this another time. Here they are, all coming out of the oven. And guys, keep in mind, you need to let these sit until they are completely cool before you fork into them to split them. If you try to cut them right now, they're just going to be gummy. So let them sit and cool before you eat them. It'll be worth it, trust me. So while these were not, great blueberry English muffins, they were still a delicious addition to our breakfast for dinner night that we had. And if you guys make them, let me know what you think. Or if you have a tried and true recipe for English muffins, let me know in the comments area. Guys, I hope you enjoyed cooking with me this week. Thanks for being here. Come back next week. We'll find something else in the recipe stash to cook up.